What is the best way to begin a story? Well, classic storytelling technique says that you have to introduce your main characters in the first few pages. And that's exactly what Matthew does, as we heard in our reading. But like many good films and books, he has a bit of a prequel, an event in the past that gives you a clue about how to interpret what's to come. A bit of an explanation for why things turned out the way they did. So what clues is Matthew giving us to look out for this Christmas? Matthew begins his book with a genealogy. It's not exactly the kind of exciting opening scene that the book trade calls a crash start. I wonder how many of us usually skip those first 16 verses, as we did this morning, to get straight to the action, the romantic young couple, the sweet little baby, the angels, then the glamorous and mysterious kings and the terrible wicked king. But if we're looking for what Matthew wants us to look out for in the rest of his book, the clues are right there in the first 16 verses. This is the first book after the Old Testament, and it begins with the names of two of the Old Testament heroes, Abraham and David. Verse 1, this is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So that immediately gives us continuity from the past. This is not a brand new story, it's a follow-on book, a sequel, the next instalment or series 2 of the same thing. So let's remind ourselves what we know about Abraham and David. One thing about Abraham is that all Jews were descended from him. So that gives Jesus his credentials as one of the fold, not an outsider, but one of God's people. The Jews were descended from his son Isaac, but in the eyes of Abraham and Sarah, that almost didn't happen. They were childless for most of their life, and it was only when they were really old, in their 90s, that Isaac miraculously came along. A miraculous baby. What does that remind you of? Matthew is saying that God had a hand in Jesus' birth, just as he did with the birth of the entire Jewish nation. Both born to women that wouldn't have conceived naturally. Right from the start, he wants us to be clear that Jesus was sent and ordained by God as part of the story that began with Abraham. How is he going to take that story forward? Matthew's gospel, as it goes on, will tell us how. Once we make that connection, it sets our mind thinking, I wonder how else Jesus might be like Abraham. Well, another thing about Abraham is his famous covenant with God. God promised to give him descendants more numerous than the stars, who would become a great nation. Jesus is not only one of the citizens of that great nation, but he extended it too. He drew people in to form a new family, a family of Christians. Like Abraham's family, they are more numerous than the stars, and they embody God's presence in the world. But this family is open to anyone, to all of us. We are part of that family, bearing the image of God and bringing his blessing to all around us. That's why we make such a fuss about Christmas. We're spreading God's blessings of peace and light and celebration to the world around us. And then God promised Abraham that he would be the God of that great family and that great nation. God said, I will be their God and they will be my people. And God kept that promise all through the ups and downs of the Old Testament. God was with his people, calling them to himself and showing them the right way to live. Then we get to Matthew, and in chapter 1, verse 22, Joseph is told that the baby will also be called Emmanuel, which means God with us. Is this the fulfillment of that ancient promise? God promised to be with his people, and now here's Jesus, a person who will live that out as his actual name. And interestingly, Matthew circles back to that at the end of his gospel. Jesus says explicitly, "I will be with you always, even to the end of the age." Matthew wants us to notice that Jesus is the same God who has been with his people since time began. And because of Jesus' promise, we know that God is still with us now. He kept his promise for 3,000 years in the Old Testament, so we can believe Jesus' promise now, 2,000 years later. And that makes all the difference. It's God's presence with us that sustains us through hard times. A word of comfort just when we need it. An uncanny peace in the middle of adversity. It's God's presence in the world that so often brings good out of the bad things that happen. Green shoots of hope in a war zone. The community spirit and friendships that's come from facing a disaster together. And it's the knowledge that we'll still be with him, but more fully in the life to come, that gives us hope on our dying day, and the courage to resist the temptation of an assisted death. So that's just one thing that Matthew wants us to look out for when he tells us that Jesus is descended from Abraham, that God is with us, and he always will be. So back to verse 1. Matthew tells us that Jesus is descended from another Old Testament hero, King David. So what's he telling us to look out for with that? David started his career as a shepherd boy on his dad's farm in Bethlehem. He was a shepherd in Bethlehem. But he was plucked from a life in the fields and chosen to be Israel's next king. When he was formally crowned in 2 Samuel chapter 5, the people recognized that God-given role, and they said, "The Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler." And that was literally true of David. But later, the prophet Micah uses the exact same phrase to describe the Messiah, the one who will save God's people from their enemies and bring them to a place of peace and security. It's the Micah reference that Herod's religious advisors pick up on, according to Matthew chapter 2. Out of Bethlehem will come a ruler who will be the shepherd of my people Israel. So when we read more about Jesus' life, we hear Jesus referred to as the Good Shepherd, the one who will shepherd God's people even more perfectly than that first shepherd king, binding up the brokenhearted and banishing enemies, be they wolves attacking the sheep or the forces of evil attacking the world. When we see that, we realize that Matthew is telling us right here at the start that Jesus is the promised Messiah who will rescue God's people. It puts his miracles into context, casting out demons, healing illnesses, even raising the dead. They all show him protecting his flock and fighting off enemies, just like King David. And Jesus still does that today. We are his flock, the sheep that he cares for, and he protects us from evil. The evil is still there, but we don't have to be defeated by it. God's presence with us shepherds us through it all. One of the first events of Jesus' life that Matthew records takes place in Jerusalem, the city of David. The Magi have arrived looking for him. They've heard that Jesus will be king of the Jews, so what more logical place to look than the palace in the capital city? After David was made king, one of his first acts in 2 Samuel chapter 5 was to capture Jerusalem from Israel's enemies. He attacked the fortress of Zion, and he made the city his own, and he named it the City of David. He went to live there, and he moved the Ark of the Covenant there too. He made it the capital, and of course it's where his palace and the temple were eventually built. A long period of peace followed as God gave David rest from his enemies. By starting Jesus' story in Jerusalem, Matthew's showing us another parallel with Jesus. He will also establish a city, a new Jerusalem. We read about that in the book of Revelation, the new Jerusalem, not the city of David, but the city of God. And it will be the capital of his kingdom when he renews the earth. Like David, Jesus will defeat any opposing forces and bring in his reign of peace. But unlike David's, Jesus' reign will last forever, and we'll be joining him in that city of everlasting rest. Thus, Matthew shows Jesus not only emerging from Israel's past, from time immemorial, but stretching out into the future as our eternal king. The contrast with Herod, I'm sure, is deliberate. And that gives us hope as we struggle through the ups and downs of daily life. It's these references to the past that enable us to trust God for the future. Matthew is helping us to see Jesus' life as the continuation of what God's been doing all through the Old Testament. We've seen the rescue and redemption and faithfulness that God has shown to Abraham and David and many others over the past 3,000 years. And that gives us confidence to trust what Matthew tells us that God is doing in Jesus' life and God's promises for the future, our future. So that's verse 1 of Matthew's Gospel. Then follows 16 verses of genealogy, a list of forefathers and foremothers, some famous and some obscure. What's the point of that? Well, I had a look at some of those names, and guess what? They're not random unknowns. Matthew is showing us that Jesus' ancestry says something about Jesus' nature and his ministry, his mission to the world. There are family resemblances that run through the list, and they tell us something about Jesus. I'm not going to go through all 42 of them, you'll be pleased to hear at this stage in proceedings, but I'll just pick out a few. Several of them were kings, as you'd expect, for descendants of the house of David. So that emphasises Jesus' royal credentials, earthly royalty, as well as a heavenly king. A man called Perez appears in verse 3. He was a twin and the son of Judah. His name means breaks out or breakthrough, because he broke out of the womb ahead of his twin brother. And several places are named after him, commemorating times when God has made a breakthrough for Israel or broken out against their enemies. Perez's descendants were also among the first to resettle Jerusalem when they left Babylon, reclaiming it after the exile. So Matthew's using Perez to suggest that Jesus is also an example of God breaking through, breaking into the world with a new reign, reclaiming the world as his undisputed home. Matthew reminds us that Perez's mum was Tamar. She was Judah's widowed daughter-in-law, and she was treated badly by Judah. So she set out to put that injustice right. It was an elaborate plan, but it worked. Judah's sins were exposed, he repented, and she got the security that was rightly hers. You can read the full story in Genesis chapter 38. It runs in the family. Jesus too will expose sin and put right injustice. The appropriate response from us is to turn away from anything we might be doing wrong and come to him. His forgiveness will make us right with God, just as Tamar and Judah were reconciled. Nahshon is less well known. He was the son of Amminadab, and he was the commander of the tribe of Judah when they were wandering in the wilderness. They led the way every time the Israelites moved on. He was the first one to bring gifts for God's service when Moses set up the new tabernacle as a place to meet with God. Jesus, also of the tribe of Judah, also leads the way as we follow him throughout our life to our own promised land, God's new Jerusalem. Jesus offers himself as the ultimate gift in service to God when he came to earth as a baby and then offered himself on the cross. Nahshon's son, Salmon, married Rahab, the Jericho prostitute, who saved the spies from capture. Their son, Boaz, married Ruth. So there's a theme of redemption here. Rahab's scarlet cord marking out her house is reminiscent of the scarlet blood on the lintels at Passover. Those households were saved by that blood and then escaped from slavery in Egypt. Rahab's scarlet cord saved her family from the destruction of Jericho, and Rahab herself was redeemed from a terrible immoral life by that rescue and then her marriage to an Israelite, Nahshon's son, Salmon. And it was their son, Boaz, who was the kinsman redeemer who married Ruth, the widowed Moabite, redeeming her from a life of poverty in a strange country. All the locals were delighted, and they blessed Boaz by praying that his family would be like the family of Perez, the son Tamar bore to Judah. This is because Ruth and Boaz's life are another example of the Lord breaking out into the bad situations in life and bringing out blessings. Ruth and Boaz did go on to have a baby, a boy called Obed, and when he grew up, his grandson was King David. And of course, we know that Jesus is the ultimate redeemer. You see, it runs in the family. Jesus can turn anyone's life around, and Matthew shows him doing that again and again in his gospel. He did it for them, and he does it for us. He breaks through into our lives and redeems all of us from the destructive power of evil, and he leads us out to a place of blessing. Just looking at a few of the names in the genealogy, we can find Matthew's hidden clues to the Jesus that he reveals in the rest of his gospel. This will be the story of a Jesus breaking into the world and claiming it for himself. He is the King who will rescue his world from evil and bring about ultimate freedom. His reign is characterized by righting wrongs and injustices, bringing peace, and turning people's lives around. This Christmas, Jesus invites us to follow him, as sheep follow a shepherd, as he leads us to a life in his kingdom and an eternal home in his new Jerusalem. And through it all, he promises never to leave us abandoned. He's with us to the very end.